Okay, cool. So I think that there's a lot of people here now, and we've got a lot to go, a lot going on. So why don't we get started? Thanks everybody for signing on from all over the world. My name is Zach Samelin. I'm a professor here at the University of Chicago in the English department, and I'll be moderating the discussion today and introducing our speakers. Just so people know, this is the first of two events about academic labor that my colleague Lauren Berlant and I have organized in a kind of critical university studies mini-series, which has been facilitated by 3CT here at UChicago, as well as the Center for Race, Culture, and Politics and the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality. And I'd really like now just especially to thank Anna Searle Jones at 3CT for making this possible in all the most important ways. And just to say a couple of things before I introduce Heather and Candace, the idea for this series comes out of conversations that have been taking place within a small and informal, very informal faculty study group that Lauren and I convened in 2019. Since then, our group has been meeting pretty regularly, even throughout the pandemic, to read scholarship in and around the field of critical university studies, very, very broadly construed, and people are allowed to do whatever they want and go on whatever jags they want. So if we're thinking group psychology, stuff about real estate on the south side of Chicago, just kind of really capacious. We've also been reflecting critically on our particular institution, the University of Chicago, and the work we do to reproduce it, and trying to better understand our positions within this university and the attachments that bind faculty and students to it, however disidentified we might be. And finally, also to imagine the possibilities that exist for meaningful political action as well as meaningful thought, either despite or as a consequence of our institutional belonging, right? And so we're really interested in that kind of dual nature of the institutional attachment. Lauren couldn't make it today, but I'd like to thank her as well for being the real organizing force behind this study group, as well as today's event and next week's event. So just about the events, they represent two prominent and I think equally compelling strains of contemporary writing and activism about institutions of higher education. Next week, I hope many of you can join us on Thursday, May 20th at 5 p.m. Nick Mitchell and Jennifer Doyle will be speaking about recent efforts to develop abolitionist frameworks for thinking and acting politically within the university. Today, our speakers, Heather Steffen and Candace Chu, will discuss a different approach that focuses on rethinking, teaching, collaborating, and transfiguring the work of scholarship and world building that shapes higher ed's architectures and everyday activities. Lauren recently described this approach to me as a visionary pragmatics that seeks to create new models of labor and value from where we are in the institution. And I think that counterintuitive phrase, visionary pragmatics, counterintuitive, I think, because pragmatism is so often dissolved into drab and visionless institutional strategizing. I think it very precisely characterizes both Candace's and Heather's important work about the contemporary university. Now just to introduce our speakers, somebody got their radio on. First, we're going to hear from Candace Chu. Candace is a professor of English, American Studies, and Critical Social Psychology at the City University of New York Graduate Center. Currently executive officer or chair of English, which is where I got my PhD. Chu teaches in such areas as aesthetics, ethnic and race studies, and queer of color critique. The author of Imagine Otherwise, On Asian Americanist Critique 2003, and The Difference Aesthetics Makes, On the Humanities After Man. Her works in progress include a collection of essays titled The Disinterested Teacher and a project tentatively titled Studying Asia. Then we'll hear from Heather Steffen, who is an affiliated scholar of the Rutgers University Center for Cultural Analysis. Her book in progress, Useful Work, Imagining Academic Labor in the U.S. University, analyzes scholar teachers' public writing about their labor from the 1890s through the present. Dr. Steffen holds a PhD in literary and cultural studies and has worked as a writing and literature lecturer and as a postdoctoral researcher. Her essays on faculty, graduate employee, and undergraduate labor have appeared in New Literary History, Cultural Logic, Radical Teacher, Academe, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. So please join me in welcoming both of our speakers, and thanks again to everybody for attending this afternoon or whatever time it is, wherever you are. So I'm just going to get out of the way for now, and Candace will go ahead, and then Heather, and then after that, I think the plan is that Candace and Heather will we'll give them some time to respond to each other, and then open it up to a Q&A where you can use your little hand wave, not your actual hand, the digital hand, and I'll moderate that. So thanks again, everybody, and let me put myself on.
Okay, thank you all so much. I'm mainly going to read because it's that time of the semester, and I'm going to try to keep going through, and I can't extemporize that easily. And I volunteered to go first mainly because I'm really eager to get to Heather's work, and I think that it will. I'm want to get my piece done so that I can get this, so that we can all get to her insights. I'm very grateful to Lauren Berlant for extending this invitation to think through these issues in this context and in Heather's company, and to Anna Searle Jones for all the legwork, and Zach Samelin, who I'm delighted to get to talk with now, since we didn't really get a chance to work together in any formal capacity when he was at the grad center, kind of overlapped for a minute, and that was it. In manifest and explicit ways and not, my remarks draw on conversations I've been having with Lauren over the years, and I'm glad to have occasion to revisit them in this specific way. I'd like to ask us as we commence that we pause and with deliberation, make ourselves aware of the people and the long histories and the long and complex histories that have unfolded to bring us together in this way, in this present, and to remember the people and communities that make each of us possible in this space. I mean in this pause to remember the ongoing dispossession and sovereignty struggles of Indigenous peoples, where I am in northern New Jersey, the historic and ongoing struggles of the Lenni Lenape peoples against settler colonialism and for sovereignty that is the condition of possibility for immigration to the United States. I want also to remember those who created space for us in the academy, who have taught us, whether in and through formal academic institutions or not, and those who study with us, whether formally students or not, perhaps especially given the focus of this event. Each of us is comprised of and made possible by, and thus are accountable to multitudes known and unknown to us, and widely distributed across time and space. At the core of how I envision and try to enact pedagogies that can help us find our collective footing in the current conjuncture is this deliberate practice of remembering as much, of that is, creating and holding space for this crowded and demanding and sometimes fraught thickness of the present to be brought to bear on the conception and practice of intellectual life as it takes place and unfolds in and through the academy. The active question for me is the consideration of what happens to the structures and arrangements of the university if we take as horizon the work of opening portals that allow us to sense and make sense of and with the historical underpinnings out of which the present emerges, that allow us to hold open space for those devastated, excluded, and or marginalized in the course of the present's emergence, that enjoin us to remember and mourn and celebrate and try to honor those who have come before and those who will come after, as well as those who are contemporaries. These are some of the propositions I offer for our collective consideration this evening, and I'll return to them again in what follows. What I'm sharing with you today brings forward ideas generated in the course of thinking about the prospects and potential of the humanities and the U.S. University as sites for radical thought, a critical path that has taken shape as the book The Difference Aesthetics Makes, and what I'm working on now, which is a collection of essays titled The Disinterested Teacher that thematizes teaching broadly construed. My research interests have been and remain tethered to my seemingly infinite preoccupation with trying to understand what and how we study, and why and with what effects. I can't seem to escape the heuristic as object of knowledge. This is undoubtedly in part the result of having been immersed in graduate school in cultural studies methodologies, which means I was trained to ask some version of what are the conditions that give rise to certain ideas, formations, understandings, situations, affects, beliefs, experiences, and in what ways are those ideas, formations, and so on legitimated and disavowed, celebrated and subordinated. This attachment to the heuristic is also a result of having been asked countless numbers of times, both in and beyond graduate school, what is Asian American literature, the institutional construct with which I'd come to identify myself? My first book was an attempt to come up with an answer to that prompt and concerned itself with the term Asian American. This recent book turns out, in a sense, to be about the latter term, literature. What is it that I do as an English professor? What claims and assumptions and conditions accompany such a position and such work? And how do they align and not with the aims of minoritarian discourses like Asian Americanist critique? I've come to understand and translate such questions in the idiom of aesthetic inquiry. Moreover, and more to the point with respect to the parameters of today's event, doing so has provided a way for me to conceptualize and practice what might be thought of as a pedagogy of a liberal humanism, as a means of navigating a variety of conditions characterizing the contemporary US university toward minoritarian ends. And I'll be offering some thoughts along these lines in what follows. One final prefatory situational note, which is that my extended and primary experiential sites of the university have been big public schools, the University of Washington, the University of Maryland at College Park, and the CUNY Grad Center. For the past dozen years, I've worked solely with graduate students and in administrative capacities as well as a teacher. The questions of what the university is and can be, what aesthetic education does and has been, and whether and how radical politics live in and through the university are for me matters that translate into curriculum and admissions practices and faculty appointments and forms and formats and forums of thought in everyday sorts of ways. I'm just now finishing up my second year as the executive officer of the English program. And so these kinds of administrative matters loom large and in specific ways for me. This is by way of noting that I understand the kinds of questions and discussions at hand to be simultaneously intellectual and practical. In this regard, I'm interested in building out infrastructures that support and elicit minoritarian subjects and thinking in practical ways. And that's part of what I understand the aims of gathering to think collectively as we are doing today to be. My comments are organized into 3 sections and run about 25 minutes in total. So first, in lieu of defense. For many of us whose intellectual genealogies are formatively rooted in ethnic studies or other minoritized and minoritarian traditions, but who find ourselves within long-lived traditional disciplines like English, the experience is regularly, perhaps even persistently, somewhere between odd and abrasive. This friction is, of course, a key source of our critical superpowers, which is to say, it fuels our collective ability to disidentify with and from institutional norms. It is from this situated vantage and in the company of others that I took notice of the growing and increasingly fervent pleas for defense of the humanities in the face of the crisis confronting them that proliferated in both popular and academic venues throughout the first decades of the century. We know that the changes regularly referred to as neoliberalization and corporatization played out in such phenomena as the growth of reliance on contingent labor and corporate and philanthropic sponsorship in place of public funding. These changes were and continue to be palpable in the everyday life of the academy and in ways I expect are experientially familiar to those present today. Yet and still, it was and remains impossible to mount hearty defense of the humanities in their received liberal form in light of the manifold critiques of their crucial role in buttressing the racial capitalist colonial modernity that is the world historical dominant we inhabit. Critiques that were articulated through such intellectual formations and genealogies as cultural studies, ethnic studies, post-colonial and decolonial and feminist and queer theorizing. Indeed, these genealogies and their corollary social and political movements may be remembered to have intentionally brought the humanities to crisis in the late middle 20th century, and with good reason. Scholars and activists of these eras insisted that universities are embedded in and bear responsibility to and for the social, which means becoming accountable for and to the relationship between institutional and curricular exclusions of the kind the liberal humanities excel in justifying, and the colonial, racial, gendered, and class hierarchies characterizing US culture and politics. In brief, as I wrote in the book, while it is impossible to ignore the manifold adverse effects of corporatization and intensifying privatization, neither is it possible to stand simply in defense of the disciplinary formations clustered under the rubric of the humanities, which have been and continue to be instrumental to the production and sustenance of social hierarchies and their subtending structures and material inequalities. This overarching proposition comes of acknowledging that the humanities and their corollary disciplinary structures have long been central to the organization and conduct of social life constituting Western civilization. They comprise the civilizational discourses that legitimate empire and capitalism, and thus are responsible to and for the violence and devastation that is Western civilization's defining quality. I suggested that from this vantage, instead of moving to defend the humanities, we are prompted to ask just what it is we are being called to defend. Moreover, we may ask the corollary question, what would a defensible humanities be and do? How, in other words, might we respond to Lisa Lowe's eloquent enunciation of the need to act within, but think beyond our received humanist tradition, to visualize, mourn, and think other humanities within the received genealogy of the human? What Lowe is describing may be understood as a turn toward poiesis, a turn from the diagnostic mode that has over the past long while helped us accumulate abundant evidence of racism and cis-heteropatriarchy and so on, such that we are ever more sure of what we are against, and toward elaborating what we are for, that is, these other humanities. Sylvia Wynter, a principal guiding intellectual light in this project, provides the formulation that clarifies that the work of deriving what we are for involves creating a rupture with the present order of things. By taking these cues from Lowe and Wynter, among others, and by following the lead of artists and writers whose work is disidentified from the liberal order, that present order of discourse to which Wynter refers, we may enunciate a humanism and humanities emergent from the liberation of the human from liberalism's grasp. That's the governing proposition of The Difference Aesthetics Makes. Such artists and writers, including Lan-Samantha Chang, Alan D'Souza, Toni Morrison, Ruth Ozeki, Langston Hughes, Monique Trong, Leslie Marmon Silko, Sarah Zay, and Carrie Mae Weems, afford the elaboration of humanisms that provisionally refer to as illiberal, generated through disidentification from bourgeois liberalism and its cognate ways of being and knowing. Illiberal humanisms bring forward an understanding of human beingness to be defined not by discrete and self-possessed individuality, but instead by constitutive relationality. They refuse bourgeois aspirations and illuminate the parochialism and meanness, and they are organized and oriented and toward and by an ethics of uncontingent care. In the course of working on this project, I came to a distinct appreciation for the potency of aesthetics and thus to an understanding of the potency of aesthetic education. Historically, as part of the Enlightenment project, aesthetics have been integral to the production and naturalization of particular kinds of differences codified as race, gender, sexuality, and so on. The aesthetic has served as a powerful axis along which the kinds of persons idealized as the modern liberal subject capable of self-governance were distinguished from those conceived to be incapable of achieving such subjectivity. In brief, the incapacity for proper aesthetic judgment signaled the difference between those who would and would not realize human potential. This differential capacity contributed to rationalizing the dehumanization necessary to racial capitalism in its partnership with colonialism and settler colonialism. And it was in part recognition of this history by women of color feminists and aligned intellectuals that contributed to the turn away from aesthetics and toward cultural studies in the 70s and 80s. Aesthetics, we might remember, was in the latter decades of the 20th century met with considerable and wholly understandable suspicion as a result of this history and how it continued to play out in contemporary forms, namely through the subordination or exclusion of minoritized artists and writings. What those artists and their work robustly demonstrate, however, is that we cannot not attend to aesthetics. For it's through aesthetics that we come not only to understand, but to feel and believe viscerally, as if inevitably and by nature, what and whom to admire and fear, what and whom to desire and detest, as well as what constitutes truth and who its rightful purveyors are, while others never can be. It is, in other words, the domain through which sensibility, which denotes both that which may be sensed, is available to the senses, and that which is judged reasonable, coordinates an intimate relationship between thinking and feeling. Accordingly, I understand aesthetics as referring to the relationships among the senses and the processes and structures of value making by which certain sensibilities become common sense and others are disavowed, subjugated, and otherwise obscured. Aesthetics in this regard emphasize sensibility and the sensus communis as crucial domains of knowledge and politics. Paying attention to them as such affords recognition of not only the relations, structures, and practices of power that legitimate and naturalize certain ideas over others, but also the knowledge and ways of living variously affirmed or subordinated in the process. We cannot not attend to aesthetics, both because they've been a crucial component in the establishment, rationalization, and reiteration of racial capitalism, colonialism, and settler colonialism by means of the production and regulation of common sensibility, and because ways of living and being radically alternative to common sense of modernity are elaborated on the terrain of sensibility. In these regards, we might understand the university to be an aesthetic regime, one in and through which common sensibility may be produced as well as disrupted. What if then, in lieu of defense, we took up the work of making sensible an illiberal sensus communis? What if what and how we thought about everything from teaching to building design to administration to research methods and credentializing mechanisms were organized around the idea that what we do is elicit and encourage and legitimate and celebrate such uncommon sensibilities according to which uncontingent care and mutuality are norms. That model as fully and diversely as possible the forms of relationality we wish to amplify, elaborate, and proliferate, and the worlds and ways of being and knowing correlating with them. I'm proposing that in lieu of defense, we renew and revitalize our commitments to understanding that the work before us is the crafting of aesthetic education, by which I mean the pedagogies and practices and orientation of the entire university toward minoritarian ends, or in other words, to use education to amplify minoritarian aesthetics, the sensibilities disidentified from common sense. We haven't been able to argue our way out of defunding or privatization or corporatization. Might we be able to elicit and induce subjectivities that not only understand, but viscerally feel to be true, the idea that public education in these revised forms should be the best resourced entities on the planet? Section 2, on the academic good life. Such minoritarian aesthetics, such illiberal sensibilities, I think are vital as sources and resources for thematizing the good life, of pressing on what it means commonsensically and apprehending how it keys us into identifying both the pull and paucity of that common sense version. Infusing my thinking along these lines is Berlant's linking of the structured demands to virtuous personhood with the aspirational ideal of a certain good life held out to be universally valid. Make good choices, be a good person, and the good life will surely be yours, such an ideal holds. In this section of my remarks, I try to convey some ideas regarding how the fantasy of the good life is precipitated by and in relation to the academy, ideas generated over the years in relation to Berlant's work. There are two lines of thought I bring forward for our collective consideration. First, I ask you to move with me through the invitation Berlant issues in an interview she gave back in 2012. So this is 2 slides, it's a little bit long, but if you'll just come with me, I think it's worth it. I love the line Mark Fisher pulls from Jameson, that it is easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. We have become so affectively so saturated by attachment to the atrophied feel of enjoyment that we are stymied trying to imagine another way of relating to others or to our own optimism. Developing symbolic practical infrastructures for alternativity is a task of progressive praxis, but it's a daunting task. The collective settlement was that as long as the economy was expanding, everyone would have a shot at creatively inventing their version of the good life, and not just assuming the position allotted to them by embedded class, racial, and gendered histories of devalued and unrecognized economic and social labor. The half century since the collective settlement was established embeds many generations in a binding fantasy. It wasn't cruel optimism to think that there would be give in the system, spreading opportunities for living beyond instrumental productivity. And yet we know that even in the good times, so many people didn't have enough hours in the day to look each other in the eye and relax. What expanded was fantasy, not time, and not a cushion of real-time money. The expansion of the credit economy in Europe and the US once the industrial growth had moved on took care of that, though, purchasing when it couldn't purchase ordinary time, and now that's being revoked too. Plus the revocation of educational democracy, a stand-in for a public investment in everyone who wanted a shot, is an admission that everyone didn't have a shot and maybe shouldn't have wanted it. How does it feel to be a bad investment has substituted itself for how does it feel to be a problem. It makes me speechless for a moment to face those blinking phrases and to consider the whole history that has transpired between them. How does it feel to be a problem? How does it feel to be a bad investment? For me, these questions constellate with the version Vijay Prashad writing about South Asianness offers. How does it feel to be a solution? That is, how he asks, can brown folk live with ourselves as we are pledged, and sometimes in an act of bad faith, pledge ourselves as a weapon against Black folk? Or in other words, how does it feel to be a good investment? Isn't it, I have wondered and continue to ask, a question necessary to ask in considering whether we are prepared, as Berlant asks us to consider whether we can bear to articulate alternative versions of the good life. In some respects, perhaps especially for those of us whose work has focalized through Asiatic racialization in and relation to the United States, these ideas will resonate against the long-established critiques of model minority discourse. So too, in a different register, will they resonate with critiques of the neoliberal celebration of individual success over structural transformation. Partly then, articulating that whole history between bad investment and problem Berlant invokes involves illuminating the processes of racialization that simultaneously deracinate and reproduce sharply inequitable life chances. The structures of policy and hegemony that produce the problem of racial difference are the same structures that produce the solution as a different racial difference. What Prashad particularizes to South Asianness translates through the history of US racialization into a comment on the operations and effects of the hegemonic policy-supported investment in whiteness central to US nation formation. In some respects, we have to live with ourselves within this system because opting out is not an option. Currently, the commonplace rhetoric of crisis bespeaks the truthfulness of the thought that it is easier, commonsensically, to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the realization of an alternative political economy. In academic terms, critique is easier than crafting, and experimental thought more difficult than reproducing knowledge. More generally, and as Berlant again suggests, people live lives of lateral sovereignty in order simply to endure the demands of life under capitalism. Willful choice and intentional decision-making appear as themselves fantasies of a kind of subjective autonomy that is simply and pervasively unavailable. I hear the rendering of education as an investment quite regularly, and typically framed as a question about the value of a doctoral degree in English given the state of the academy. Is it worth it to invest 6, 7, 8 years in a degree program to not get a job? Do we get anywhere, I wonder, by reframing that question to something like, what would make it worth it to invest so many years and not get a job in the academy? Or to press on the idiom and logics that connect education with investment, what if, instead of a professionalization model, we conceive of doctoral studies as 5 years in CUNY terms, our packages are 5 years of funding, during which you're paid, however minimally, to work with ideas and toward the ends of building worlds in which basic well-being, food, housing, health, are not contingent on degrees and institutional coverage. I do not mean these to be rhetorical questions, but practical ones. That is, I've been thinking of my job as EO as tasked with holding open space for people who might not otherwise be able to take up intellection as primary work, and for ideas that might not otherwise be able to develop. But I think there has to be more that's possible through the academy than the production of a landing spot for what turn out to be a select few. I don't think, though, that the logics of investment get us to that something more. So yes, I'm keenly aware of these conditions and contradictions in the normality of thinking education as investment. Again, in graduate education, that link is regularly expressed in terms of the unlikelihood of a tenure-track job after completing the doctoral degree. The fact is, one can, and many have, done all the right things and made all the right choices, and still the jobs aren't there. Still others have found it necessary to deploy what Laura Kang has so generatively framed as an exit strategy, not a plan B, but an affirmative exit strategy, in order to survive and perhaps even thrive when the academy becomes or became too much to bear. In all this, perhaps there is something to understand about the temporality of the good life, about a desire for its durability and steadfastness, and how these conditions might themselves be cruelly optimistic attachments getting in the way of our individual and collective flourishing. Part of the difficulty in encouraging and facilitating disidentification with the academic good life is that we in fact elicit such fantasies in specific ways, which leads me to the second line of thought on the good life I wish to share today. In broad strokes, we may note that key elements of the good academic life for politically engaged practitioners includes the belief that knowledge work is related to and can transform the world writ large. So clearly and so long has education participated in social stratification, and so formative to the contemporary have the legacies of the activists and scholars of the middle-late 20th century been, that the university as a site of the sociopolitical is by now axiomatic. In addition to this understanding of the beyond academic social relevance and impact of academic life, it seems to me that the idea of the university as a kind of refuge for non-normativity, a place that might accommodate unconventional desires and ways of being and perhaps even allow them to flourish, quite trenchantly operates. Coupled with the social status assigned to the academy and the promise of job security adhering to the idea and ideal of a tenure-track position, the fantasy that the academy is the good life for the unconventional or counter-hegemonic, the anti-racist, queer, feminist, and so on subject is quite powerful. In recognizing these elements as, to use Berlant's idiom, part of a cluster of promises held out by the fantasy of the academic good life, we may also acknowledge how actively we shape optimistic attachments to it. How better to understand the function of the personal statement required of applicants. We in effect compel the narrativization of an optimistic attachment, thus either ratifying an existing fantasy or inducing one. We might understand as well that our responses to reading such statements index our own fantastic attachments. To what extent does identification with our own desire for well-being condition our responses? The act of applying is itself optimistic, an intentional act that cannot but be driven by fantasy and the wishfulness of the temporality of the what will have been. The kinds of attempts in which I, and I know many others have been involved, to expand the pool of people of color applying to and enrolling in graduate programs might along these lines be seen as efforts to materialize optimistic relationships to the fantasy of the academic good life among minoritized populations. Consciously and not, I harbor a strong attachment to the idea of a deeply and thoroughly diversified, racially and otherwise, academic scene, in significant part because a massive transformation in and beyond the university would have had to have taken place for such a reality to have materialized. Surely it is the case that the applicant narratives that are most compelling to me are those that somehow seem to share this orientation. This gets us to the politics of reproduction, not of subjects, but of fantasies. If we pay particular attention to the ways in which our own attachments condition the selection not of a student, but instead of a particular fantasy of the good life, the ways in which the ordinary practices of the university reproduce the privileging, the mattering of some attachments over others comes into relief. Berlant's analyses regarding the overvaluation of a certain mode of virtuously intentional, self-reflective personhood resonate here. The genre of the personal statement requires the applicant to cast themselves as a heroic protagonist for whom thinking is both a constitutive characteristic and the reward for overcoming the obstacles to its pursuit. The non-alignment between the heroic story and the absence of guarantees that continuing investment in it, the idea that the virtually intentional self-reflective person will in fact be rewarded with the good life, will come to fruition, strikes me as an ideal condition for inducing precarity. It does no good simply to advise that fantasy is fantasy. As Berland reminds us, attachments are not made by will after all. Final section, which is short. So what if minoritarian knowledge is impossible? Some years ago, I was invited to offer remarks on a panel dedicated to the future of feminist education. As I tried to write my comments, all I kept thinking was, shouldn't all education be feminist? Or in other words, what's the education that's designated not feminist? Similar questions and scenarios unfold everywhere across the academic landscape, of course, and in ways that reflect the logic of possessive territoriality that is the current arrangement of knowledge. It is a logic that allows for the distribution of responsibility and accountability for difference in ways that enable institutional stasis. We can see this clearly not only in curricular designations that categorically parse out responsibility for cis-heteronormativity, say, to women and gender studies, and racism to Black and Africana and ethnic studies, and so on, as well as to the ubiquitous diversity task forces and committees that are asked to carry the load for entire departments and sometimes entire institutions. I have of late been pushing on these formations and formulations to try to reactivate and energize a version of the creative invention of the good life articulated to the work of the Academy. For example, what shakes loose or shifts if we conceive of diversity not in terms of the underrepresentation of certain groups, but instead of the overrepresentation of whiteness? If we ask what's happening in the spaces, not designated as feminist or ethnic studies or Black studies, how might such shifts in framing and sensibility catalyze and bring forward new and renewed commitments to making sense of and with the historical underpinnings out of which the present emerges, that allow us to hold open space for those devastated, excluded, and or marginalized in the course of the present's emergence, that enjoin us to remember and mourn and celebrate, and to try to honor those who have come before and those who will come after, as well as those who are contemporaries. These are the questions with which I opened my remarks and to which I circle back so that we might dwell in them collectively. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Candace. I think we'll just take a moment for virtual applause or muted actual applause. Or unmuted, if you want to go for it. And then you can just go straight into Heather, into your presentation whenever you're ready.
Okay. I will also be reading and off my screen, so I hope I don't look too much like a robot for this whole thing. But I think these two talks are going to speak to each other in some really interesting, kind of unexpected ways that I think is exactly why Lauren asked us to do this together. So thank you, Candace, immensely for that. And thanks to Lauren, Zach, Anna, for bringing this event together. And I also want to thank a few people that helped me put these ideas together, because they are extremely new ideas that I'm working with right now. So those people are Isaac Kamola, Rana Jalil, Eric Vasquez, and Nora Devlin, and they were really helpful. So my current project is the sort of academic workers inquiry. It seeks to understand how US academic workers imagine the nature and content of their labor and its meanings, goals, and values by analyzing scholar teachers' public writing about academic labor and their critiques of higher education. The project asks, when and how do the ways we imagine and practice scholarly work constrain efforts to organize academic workers or impede projects to transform institutions of higher education? And on the other hand, how might different ways academics imagine their relation to their work serve as resources for organizing or as heuristics for reimagining higher education and the production of knowledge? I think heuristic will be a key word today. Thus far in my analysis of professors' public writing from the 1890s through the present, I've identified what I refer to as three traditional models of academic labor: professionalism, unionism, and vocationalism, and an emerging entrepreneurial model. These models, I hypothesize, serve as both behavior shaping ideologies and as rhetorical resources. They overlap and diverge, and I don't mean to say that we could identify individual scholar teachers as inhabiting particular models. Rather, these models are heuristics, concepts to think with as we approach questions of academic labor organizing and university critique. In this talk, I focus on the vocational ethic as it appears in writing about academic labor by women faculty of color and working class scholars. I begin by defining the sense of vocation and the core goals and values of academic vocational workers. Then I will describe the vocationalist critique of academic labor and professionalism. And finally, I will posit the need for a new concept, devocationalization, to describe the past and present exclusion, surveillance, and immiseration of vocational academics. This work is incomplete and under construction, so I'm very much looking forward to your feedback. But I think that these initial ideas can spark some interesting questions. Among these might be, how can we capture and express the structures of feeling that surround work in the university without relying on the worn trope of crisis? What possibilities open up when we decenter professionalism as our primary relation to academic work? And how could naming the vocational orientation to academic work build new connections and strengthen existing ties between workers across campus and beyond? The concept of vocation I'm using here draws on education scholar David Hanson's 1994 essay, Teaching in the Sense of Vocation, and on Wendy Brown's reading of Max Weber's 1918 vocation lectures. Both take off from the secular connotation of vocation as a calling to a particular occupation in which one serves others. For Hanson, the sense of vocation is simultaneously personal and social, affective, practical, and creative. Quote, the sense of vocation finds its expression at the crossroads of public obligation and personal fulfillment, he writes, and it takes shape through involvement in work that has social meaning and value. Vocations offer a source of intrinsic meaning in work that does not depend on external reward or approval, and they provide a sense of self and identity for those who inhabit them. At the core of Hanson's definition, however, is the social directionality of the sense of vocation. The performance of vocational work serves others, imbues the worker's life with a quote, social mission, and can only be conducted through a social medium, like teaching, healthcare, family life, or art. Vocations embed their practitioners in worldly concerns and within webs of relationships and responsibility. The affective orientation of vocational work complements this embedded social positioning. Hanson writes that the sense of vocation, quote, presumes a hopeful, outward-looking sentiment, a feeling of wanting to engage the world in some substantive way. Much of that engagement will, of course, take place not in heroic moments of transformation, but during the mundane tasks that take up much of a worker's time. In Hanson's view, quote, a person enacting a vocation has both an active and creative relationship with the work. Vocational workers shape and reshape the roles they inhabit, following from their, quote, disposition to be of service in a form that can evolve as one responds to one's circumstances. In order for the sense of vocation to be fulfilled, vocational workers must enjoy some agency and relative autonomy in their work, answering above all to the communities and social needs that they serve. Brown's reading of vocation similarly highlights the social and service connotations of the term, but following Weber, Brown is concerned as well with the conditions in which labor is performed and how the vocational worker approaches them. Like Hanson's vocational worker making creative tweaks to better align everyday practices with their social purposes, Brown and Weber's vocational scholars and politicians also do two kinds of work. They work to grasp the conditions that constrain the performance of their vocational ethics and to creatively find ways to align their work with their ethics despite those conditions. At the heart of vocationalist ethics, Brown contends, is, quote, relentless responsibility for the effects, intended and inadvertent, of one's conduct in the sea of powers contextualizing each endeavor. In sum, to have a vocation means to enact a personal and social, affective, practical, creative, and critical orientation to one's work. Academic vocational values and goals revolve around scholarly and teacherly commitments to investigating inequality and forwarding social justice in the humanities and social sciences, and to basic research and solving human problems in the sciences and engineering. Vocational academics enact these commitments across their teaching, research, and service. They position these socially focused values and goals against the drive for career success that characterizes the professionalist and entrepreneurial approaches. As Native American scholar Beth Boyd writes in Presumed Incompetent, quote, "To many of us, success never had anything to do with being rich, famous, published, or funded. Success means helping our people, connecting to others, being real, and making things better for our families and communities. It is essential to find a way to integrate that definition into the work we do." Vocational academics are often found in lower ranked, broad access, and teaching intensive institutions, and they often occupy positions that emphasize service over research. The vocational approach to teaching takes into account students' intellectual and personal development at the same time that it recognizes the material conditions of student learning and validates student goals, including the goal of getting a good job and hoping to achieve upward mobility. For instance, in an essay on teaching writing to working class students, William Macaulay contends that we need to displace traditional notions of teaching writing and, quote, "move toward a genuine interaction with the lives, priorities, and meaning-making activities of the students we encounter and the cultural context that our teaching serves." As teachers, that is, vocational academics are responsive to student needs because those needs make up a part of the social medium through which they work. This approach to the university involves devoting significant time and energy to advising and mentoring students and to service and governance. As the editors of the Working in Class collection describe it, quote, "Our teaching and mentoring work extends beyond the classroom into office hours, mentoring research at field sites, supervising student teaching, advising student groups, planned meetings with students at coffee shops, and unplanned discussions on academic malls." For vocational academics from marginalized and minoritized racial, ethnic, gender, and other groups, the purpose of this extra pedagogical work is imagined in terms of what Ruth Barkan calls big temporalities, legacies from the past and visions of a collective future. These academic workers see their labor as embedded in traditions of service to their communities, as preparing a more socially just world for future generations, and as easing the path for students who look like them. As in Hanson's definition of vocation, these teachers' personal goals and identities are enmeshed with the social goals of their work. Vocational scholars bring their commitments to ameliorating inequality and forwarding social justice into their research as well. A vocational ethic can permeate a researcher's choices about what to study, what methods to employ, and how to relate to the subjects of one's research. Much basic science and politically committed and activist research could be seen as vocationally motivated. For example, a number of working class scholars describe their commitment to research that will have an impact defined not by its citation count, but by its effects on the world beyond the ivory tower. Timothy Haney, for instance, found that, quote, "working class academics discussed how their class backgrounds prompted them to be more practical in their research and less theory driven. For these participants, research, like teaching, should work as a tool for social change and should not be disconnected from everyday concerns." In brief, and there is a lot I've had to leave out here and generalize about in consideration of time, vocational academics value student learning, research toward social justice and basic science ends, and service as a means to address inequities on campus. Vocational understandings of the academy are clearly theories of academic labor, but they're rarely treated as such. So for the rest of this talk, I want to ask the question, what could further attention to academic vocationalism make visible about academic labor as a whole? Paying attention to vocational work and to vocational scholars' testimonial writing about their work reveals the many varieties of unprofessional academic labor that make up the daily life of a campus, despite being rendered invisible in professionalist accounts of academic life and in university rankings and marketing materials. These unprofessional modes of labor include emotional and care work, routine tasks, the affective and embodied aspects of our work, and the, quote, "sustained creativity," in Hanson's terms, that goes into shaping and reshaping everyday practices to better serve students, communities, and the ends of social justice. These are modes of work that escape the metrics and assessments used by managerial and professionalist leaders alike to measure productivity and impact. Yet they are crucial both to fulfilling the institution's goals and to making work meaningful for many scholar teachers. As critics of the university and academic labor practices, vocational writers take a different tack than do their professionalist and unionist colleagues. Professionalist writers tend to focus on processes of deprofessionalization, corporatization, privatization, and neoliberalization, and on how those processes impact tenure, academic freedom, shared governance, and the balance of power between the faculty and the administration. Their chief concern is for the intellectual conditions of the university, including the autonomy of research and teaching, and the central role they believe professors should play in shaping higher education policy and procedures. Unionist writers tend to focus on the material conditions of academic labor, on strategies for organizing and collective bargaining, and on the university's participation in national and transnational political economies. Vocational critics, on the other hand, begin from the premise that one cannot produce valuable teaching, good research, or effective service in poor working conditions. The contingent advocacy group, the New Faculty Majority, for instance, uses the slogan, "Faculty working conditions are student learning conditions," which captures this message exactly. From this premise, vocational critics agree with professionalists and unionists on a number of issues, like opposing the routinization of teaching, the surveillance of students and faculty via online learning platforms, and the unacceptable conditions of part-time faculty employment. Their critiques take administrative and managerial agents to task for producing these damaging working and learning conditions. But vocationalists part ways with professionalists by including academic professional culture among the targets of their criticism. From the vocational viewpoint, professionalism and its attendant and dominant work culture are complicit with and reproduce gender, racial, and class inequities among academic workers. This vocational critique of professionalism is particularly clear in the two presumed incompetent volumes, which collect personal essays by women faculty of color. According to these narratives, modes of vocational labor like teaching, mentoring, and service are sites of contest between vocationalist and professionalist tendencies in the faculty workforce. The core problem is that vocational modes of work are devalued in professional evaluation procedures, and much of the labor of service, teaching, advising, and counseling students is erased by official documentation and takes place beyond the notice of colleagues. The second portion of the vocational critique of professionalism in Presumed Incompetent contends that professional culture is a fertile breeding ground for bias and for racial and gender violence. In numerous testimonials, academic culture is represented as a hostile environment for racialized women scholars through the dominance of white masculine professional norms of competitive individualism. Speaking to the oppressiveness of this culture, Pamela Twyman Hoff writes that individualism, rationalism, progressivism, and universalism, quote, act as the barometers determining academic standards and shaping norms and rules of engagement. They are the power brokers' indicators of productivity, collegiality, value, and capacity, end quote. The very values which define academic professionalist culture, that is, can be weaponized to prevent women scholars of color from advancing into the upper echelons of the academic hierarchy. In the face of these kinds of criticism, the professionalist response is to call for stronger, more transparent policies to protect academic workers from bias and discrimination. Yet it appears that professionalism's strongest tool for changing academic workplaces, its reliance on proceduralism, especially the procedures of promotion and tenure, is in fact insufficient to protect scholars' job security and academic freedom. The tenure system enshrines professionalist ideology by placing the responsibility for choosing colleagues partly in the hands of the faculty, and by relying on a version of peer review to ensure that scholars are judged by those most capable of evaluating their work, other experts in the field. What the tenure stories in Presumed Incompetent reveal, however, is that it is precisely the peer reviewing nature of tenure that allows space for bias, implicit and explicit, to enter into and wreck the nominally meritocratic ends of this professionalist procedure. Though each one is different, these tenure stories make clear that pre-tenure is a time of great precarity for women faculty of color, and all the stories share a common arc. An exceptionally qualified candidate of color, usually one with numerous high-impact publications, excellent course evaluations, and a higher than average service record, comes up for review a year or two before tenure, expecting to find that she's well prepared to enter the evaluation process. At the review, she learns that a flaw has been found in her record. Several worrying course evaluations, publications that are forthcoming but not yet in print, articles that fail to meet her colleagues' standards, or complaints about her lack of collegiality. She is shocked, But from there, she must fight a battle of documentation, appeal, and coalition building in order to navigate, and in most but not all of the presumed incompetent cases, succeed in the tenure process. Where we can see the combined power of professionalist peer review and the presumption of incompetence to disrupt or derail careers is in the process by which these flaws in a candidate of color's record are supposedly uncovered. As Jemima Lee Young and Dorothy Hines write, quote, senior faculty often attempt to amass evidence of negligence or deficiency to justify devaluing a Black woman's work by cherry picking within each category to identify the smallest of their weaknesses. Other authors of tenure stories cite incidents in which they discovered colleagues had failed to read their dossiers, dismissed their research methods or writing style as unscholarly, or combed through hundreds of course evaluations to locate one negative comment. Overall, the presumed incompetent collections provide a clear picture of the reality of very low numbers of women of color who make it to senior faculty positions. Women of color are not failing to achieve tenure. Instead, this vocationalist critique makes clear the professionalist procedures of tenure are failing to prevent the bias and discrimination found in predominantly white institutions from derailing their careers. Based on vocationalism's critique of professionalist culture and the failures of professionalist proceduralism to ameliorate inequities even within the tenure track professoriate, it appears that an analysis of academic labor conditions that takes the vocationalist experience into account may be in need of new conceptual frameworks for understanding the situation of academic workers today. To that end, I propose that we consider developing a theory of devocationalization that could decenter the professional viewpoint in academic labor criticism and provide a less compromised framework upon which to build critique and organize academic workers. The terms we currently use to discuss what has happened to higher education and academic workers since the 1970s all draw our focus to the diminishing status, social power, and economic position of the profession as a whole. Among these, and here comes a bunch of long words, among these are deprofessionalization, proletarianization, adjunctification, and casualization, along with corporatization, privatization, and neoliberalization. In the case of college and university faculty, deprofessionalization is marked by loss of decision-making power through the weakening of shared governance structures, loss of autonomy in research and teaching through external attacks on academic freedom and insecure employment arrangements, and an overall decline in social status and power for members of the profession. Deprofessionalization has become a well-worn framework for understanding today's academic labor conditions, and it has served as a rallying point for professionalist critics and activists like those attached to the AAUP. However, from the vocationalist standpoint, deprofessionalization as a historical narrative carries with it several conceptual problems that limit its potential as a starting point for critique and organizing. First, because deprofessionalization looks at academic workers as a whole profession, it fails to acknowledge the uneven distributions of professional privilege that have existed between faculty since at least the emergence of the US research university in the late 19th century. These privileges have been differentially enjoyed across institutional types, regions, and racial, gender, and class groups. The concept of deprofessionalization also implies that all members of the profession will feel the effects of the loss of social power, autonomy, and self-management in the same ways or to the same degree, which is simply not the case. Second, the historical implotment implied by the concept of deprofessionalization depends on the assumption that at some point in the past, things were good for all or most members of the profession. As a number of recent decolonial and abolitionist scholars have pointed out, in university critique, this takes the form of an often unintentional yet nonetheless structuring nostalgia for the post-war golden age university. The issue with this fall from grace narrative is its elision of the many inequities and exclusions that define the post-war era in higher education, where women faculty were few and people from minoritized communities were barred from candidacy for both education and academic jobs. Many groups, that is, have never enjoyed the privileges of full academic professional status, or what Candace is calling the academic good life. Further, the golden age narrative that undergirds the concept of deprofessionalization papers over the sources of funding and public support for the post-war university, which were derived in large part from military buildup during the Cold War, hardly a funding base that we should be eager to adopt again. Finally, deprofessionalization is a sterile concept. It elides the affective, embodied, and social aspects of faculty experiences in higher education today and over time. Deprofessionalization takes a view from 30,000 feet up, understanding the position of academic workers in the larger system of professions and through a broad political economic analysis. This perspective certainly has its uses, but the experiences, emotions, and modes of labor that are the central focus of academic vocational testimony and critique are rendered invisible from this height. In contrast, I would like to propose devocationalization as an alternative historical narrative and social process that highlights the unevenly experienced individual and collective, affective, embodied, and antisocial effects of the immiseration and surveillance of vocational modes of labor in US higher education. Crucial to this conceptualization is that devocationalization is not new, but has been experienced by those throughout the 20th century and before who feel called to advanced education and scholarship, yet are denied entry to higher education or the academic profession, denied adequate resources to perform their work, or who continue to experience heightened precarity even in tenure track jobs due to their gender, race, class, or other identity. Instead of describing an occupational sector's fall from a position of collective social power, devocationalization indexes the individual and collective harm that radiates out into families, communities, and institutions when an individual or category of individuals are denied the opportunity to fulfill their vocational callings. As such, I conceptualize devocationalization as an affective, embodied, and antisocial process that takes place at the levels of both the individual and the collective, and is driven primarily by regimes of exclusion, contingency, and surveillance. The affective dimension of devocationalization indexes the array of painful public and private emotions attached to thwarted vocational motivations. They're captured in genres like quit lit, personal essays by those leaving the academic profession, and adjunct lit, novels about life off the tenure track. For those who stay in academe despite discrimination, bias, and bad working conditions, frustration, resentment, and anger may define the affective landscape. Ro Bubar, for instance, captures the frustration that women academics of color may feel when she asks, quote, "How come we talk of simply sustaining ourselves while our colleagues appear to be well positioned to explore the academy in a multitude of ways that feed them professionally? How come simply sustaining ourselves, surviving versus thriving, becomes the standard for women of color in the academy?" End quote. These painful emotions may be felt and expressed not only by those denied entry to or stable employment within academe, but also affect their families, colleagues, and communities. When critics talk about the situation of academic labor today in terms of deprofessionalization, the language of political economy and material hardship can easily overwhelm considerations of its emotional toll. And as Susie Nam reminds us, professionalism itself is, quote, often equated with comportment that demonstrates little emotion. To begin to name and honor the affective dimension of devocationalization instead emphasizes the harm and violence that both past and present instantiations of the university have caused. The embodied dimension of devocationalization points both to the physical and psychological effects of poor academic working conditions and to the ways these effects are differentially felt across races, genders, classes, and other identities. Ruth Barkan explicitly links the damaging embodied aspects of contingency to vocational motivations, as she contends that, quote, "vocationalism's very inhabitability is at risk." She continues, "Many academics, especially women and especially mothers, find meeting the multiple personal and professional demands close to not doable. The embodied labor required of a vocation is simply too great, and the gendered relations and temporal architectures that traditionally underpinned a vocational relation to work are fracturing, or for casual staff, simply not in place. The crisis, if it is one, is less a values crisis than a somatic one and a financial one." End quote. Providing further evidence that devocationalization is indeed a somatic process, a recent study by Michelle Gorzyka and Paul Spector compared the physical and psychological health of those living their vocation, those with a thwarted vocation, and those who had never felt the sense of a calling. Those with thwarted vocational leanings demonstrated significantly poorer physical and mental health than both those living a vocation and those with no calling at all. The final dimension of devocationalization is its antisociality. by dividing workers against themselves through exclusion and stratification, denying adequate resources for the performance of vocational modes of labor, and fostering a workplace culture littered with mundane antisocial structures and moments, processes of devocationalization in the academy both inhibit the formation of networks and communities and degrade those already in existence. Devocationalization, that is, shuts down the relational and responsible impulses that distinguish a vocational approach to academic labor. How then might we respond to devocationalization in a way that makes use of these insights into the academic vocational ethic and critique of the university? My initial and tentative thoughts are that identifying vocationalism and articulating the current situation of academic workers as one of devocationalization as well as deprofessionalization could lead us to modify both our critiques of the university and our approaches to organizing. By understanding that not all academic workers sign on to professionalist values or enjoy professional working conditions, we can begin to decenter the professionalist critique of the university and to consider what other perspectives might add to our analyses of academic labor. Decolonial and abolitionist approaches are producing new ways to understand university history, the university's roles in society, and possibilities for scholarship and study beyond the university. I believe that a vocationalist orientation, with its emphasis on relationality and responsibility, and the concept of devocationalization, with its long historical view and its focus on the affective, embodied, and social, could provide points of connection between decolonial and abolitionist approaches and academic labor organizing. In our organizing as workers, I believe that explicitly combining the vocationalist ethic with a unionist analysis of political economy into something we might call vocationalist unionism may open new conceptions of what is possible with collective action and could bring new coalitions of workers together on and beyond campus. It might even shift how we approach the goal of labor organizing in academia, prompting us to ask, what could happen if we imagined our labor conditions not as constraints to be managed through collective bargaining, but instead organized around the question, what conditions do we require to complete the work we're called to do? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Heather. That was fantastic. Wow. Okay, so there's a lot to think about. And I think absolutely a lot of overlap and different ways of approaching similar kind of problem areas in thinking about the university. So if you guys are still into it, I thought, we had thought that it would be a really great moment for you guys to, for the two of you to interact with each other and respond to each other's talks. I mean, I think there's, it's one thing that I noticed in both of your talks that I thought was really provocative was that you each had a kind of your own way of describing, let's say, conflicting modes of describing what the university does, right? So in Heather, in your case, you have these four frameworks for understanding academic work. But Candace, I was also really struck in your talk by the way that education and ideology, right, which is a kind of binary of sorts, right, are kind of easily interchangeable in a certain sense, whereas like you seemed not interested in the apologetic defense of education as something that is conceptually distinct from ideology, but rather being like, yeah, these are sort of the same thing. And, it depends whose ideology we're talking about. But in both cases, I was just really interested in the way that each of you were kind of using these different frameworks for describing academic work or the kind of production that happens in a university. But that was just sort of one avenue I thought that you might want to explore. But if you guys have things that you want to talk about now for a little bit, and then we'll open up the floor to questions from the audience.
Well, one thing, I mean, this is a little bit to the side, Zach, of what you're talking about. Heather, I really appreciated your comments, and there's so many ideas in my head, so I'm trying to pull them in a little bit. But one of the things, right, that strikes me across our very different approaches is actually neither of us is interested in sitting with crisis. I find that kind of curious, actually. I mean, and because sometimes I feel almost, I feel wrong, like as in I should be thinking about crisis more as itself. But I can't seem to bring myself there, right? I can't get there. And I wonder the extent to which, like, are there other ways of describing the situation that people are living in, right, that aren't using the language of crisis, but are using something else? So whether it's precarity or whether it's uncertainty, or I don't know, I don't know what the other terms are that are coming out across your research, but I'm interested in, like, what is the lexicon that we want to put forward, right, that can get us out of the sort of flat-footedness of crisis.
Yeah, I think yeah, crisis is a really difficult word, right? Because I mean, when you look back through the history of people writing about the US university, we have never not been in crisis, according to somebody, and typically according to most people. So I mean, it seems that a crisis orientation is maybe constitutive in part of academic identity, right? This kind of sense of being under attack somehow from whatever source it may be throughout time. Um, and I think that's what leaves me floundering enough to come up with this really ugly multi-syllable word of devocationalization to kind of get at um, that feeling, right, of something being deeply wrong and having been deeply wrong for a long time, and yet we have these attachments that you spoke about to this institution or to the work that the institution can do or something, right? But
Yeah. No, I guess just along the lines, as you were talking, and I was thinking really in Lauren's idiom, right, about attachments and fantasies and cruel optimisms, and that question that she poses about whether we can bear to remake these ideas, these fantasies. And in some ways, it seemed like part of what your research is doing is showing what the toll is, right, in actually having them remade. So it isn't volitional. I don't opt to get into the situation where I have to experience this thing, but situationally, right, this is what we're going through. That's what it looks like. Yeah, that's what it feels like. So there, it's not a simply celebratory model, right? We're not saying like, yay, radical politics, and here's the revolution and all is well, but rather, oh my God, this is really hard. And that term, I can't remember who you were quoting from, but somatic crisis, that one actually resonated for me, the use of crisis there. And there is something about that, like the bodily disaggregation, the dissolving of a body, right? For the sake of an ideal or for the sake of an attachment, that I think is really powerful.
Well, I guess, and one thing I wanted to pick up on too that I think linked ours is, despite maybe not wanting to deal with the concept of crisis or finding it unhelpful, I think when you said that the one goal is to sort of elaborate what we're for rather than against, and I know a couple of our colleagues who wrote the abolitionist studies invitation are on the call too, and they asked that question of what would an abolition university say yes to, and I do feel like there's this there's something really good happening right now in that folks want to be looking on this end. Like it seems that the crisis narrative has gotten us so far. We're so good at naming the sources of crisis that we're just sick of it, that it's too easy, it's low-hanging fruit, it gets us nowhere. And what do we say yes to? And I feel like that's a really it's interesting. I think it's partly it's hard to talk about what to say yes to in the academy because we're so attuned to the critical mode. And I feel like that's part of what both of our projects are trying to get at. I mean, mine's sort of looking at the almost like the utterly naive, right, of the vocational call to be a scholar or to be a teacher. And where does that utterly naive yet social important, Hanson has this kind of notion that we should look at the person with the vocational call as being important, that they feel something, they have some self-knowledge about themselves that we should kind of honor and recognize. And so I think there's something to that almost naive position of the vocation that I think is really important for asking what we say yes to. I mean, it's going to take us to places that are not theoretically sexy and that are not cool and that are fuzzy and mushy. And I think we probably need to accept that going forward.
Yeah. I think you know, somewhere in there I kept thinking about, because of course I was like, oh, do I feel a vocation? You know, and I don't actually, but what I do, what I'm all addicted to, and I think the thing that keeps me going and attached here is pleasure. It's just fun, you know, to be in this conversation. There is a certain kind of pleasure in seminar rooms. You know, this is one of the just on a personal level, the thing that I miss most is actually that, right? So I want, and when I think about, you know, well, what are we for, right? It is really about proliferating. Like, look, you don't have to just settle on this very narrow vision of what the good life is. Look at this huge range of possibilities that we haven't even started to really proliferate, right? Really understand what the fullness of that could be. Because we're all still kind of within these institutional structures that are really, really modulating what that's possible. And that for me really is about, like, you know, so when do you feel joy, you know? And it's never an uncomplicated joy, right? Because especially if you're working with the kinds of questions and issues and histories that we're working with, it should be deeply conflicted, you know, but there, and joy is something different, I think, than happiness, you know, or just kind of a simple sort of pleasure. There is something really full and robust there that I kind of want to hold on to, that as we let go of something like a vocation, right? Or certainly the professional, you know, which we definitely need to jettison.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I think I was going to point that out as another clear point of connection between ours.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you know, and it's interesting because I mean, at various moments, I have been the placement director or whatever, you know, all these sorts of things. And I think of professionalization when I use it. I think what I am doing is demystifying the profession. Like, this is what I'm trying to do, is to get away from, you know, all this is how it actually works in the back, right? Which is not exactly what I think professionalism is supposed to be, but it's not totally removed from that either.
Well, it's and the demystifying is so important if you're working with anyone who isn't sort of to the manner born when it comes to to this, right? I mean, that's sort of, we're always in a demystifying mode.
That's right.
Yeah, as good teachers at least. But I would love to hear questions from folks. If we
why don't we start to open it up? So if people want to, you know, get in line with your hand raising button, we have some time left for sure.
I see.
Okay.
Naama?
Naama, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Thank you so much for both of these talks. And also, I was fascinated by the resonances and your different approaches. And Heather, the way that you just spoke about naivete is still kind of, I'm still processing that and find that very thought-provoking. And in some ways that connects to the question that I wanted to ask, that in response to Candace's talk, which is that I found really fascinating and very resonant the way that you spoke about the personal statement. And to me, it relates to a kind of line in the broader conversation about kind of critical university studies and abolitionist approaches to the university, which is that it seems like you're describing both the kind of the reading of the personal statements, but also maybe the mentoring of people who are crafting these kinds of statements as a kind of moment of moral peril, right? Where there's a kind of, that you're at a precipice of reinforcing and reproducing the most insidious kind of aspects of academic culture. And I guess as I was trying to kind of think about my own experience, both of reading and of advising people who are producing these texts, the term irony came as kind of, as to my mind, as another kind of maybe aesthetic position in some ways, or a term that comes from aesthetics in some sense, but also that stands in a kind of interesting tension with precisely with naivete, or a naive position, right? That is kind of, but I don't know that it's, I also find myself uncomfortable with that notion that being ironic or fostering a kind of irony and say in one's colleagues and students in relation to these kind of institutional ceremonies that we practice. Yeah, whether that solves, how that relates to kind of the way that you're talking about aesthetics and to the kind of moral question, if that makes sense.
It does. I mean, I think I don't tend to think in terms of morals or morality or, you know, kind of, it's not a register I think in very easily, but and I don't think I mean it in I don't think I mean that moment of kind of coaching or reading or exercise so much as I think we have to learn how to recognize the forms and genres that are operating to reproduce certain kinds of fantasies of social mobility, of uplift, of, you know, all the kinds of meritocratic discourses, right? You know, oftentimes those narratives, right, are, and the prompts for them are, you know, what's the obstacle that you have faced? How did you overcome that, right? So we're embedding it into the questions that we're posing. What would happen if we actually didn't do that? And so when I read for personal statements, you know, the things that I don't mind the kind of professionalized, oh, here's somebody who actually understands what the arc is that we're supposed to be looking for. But the ones that really stick with me are the really curious ones, you know? Oh, you know, I took this class in the medieval and I was really interested in that. And then there was this class on Toni Morrison and I was really interested in that, you know, like that's the person who I think, oh, I want to talk to you about everything because you're interested in everything, right? So that's about me, like my reading practice, as much as it is about the kind of formal conventions. And, you know, I love that you use that term, kind of the rituals and the ceremonies that we use, right? Like how are we actually inculcating people in and maybe actually producing a vocational sense of what it is to be a student, right? In addition to what it is to be a teacher. And that feels to me like something that we can undo. You know, Heather, the other thing that I kept thinking, and this is a kind of a separate part of one of the essays that I've been working on, but it's really this term collegial, you know, and I just like, I want that to be the model in a way, not vocation, not profession, not teacher and not student in some way, right? But actually like, what's the collegiality that we are practicing and inhabiting? And it's not a disavowal of differential power relations or anything like that. It's just to say, this only works if we get into the muck together and do the work. Right. And so service is collegiality, like that is a intellectual pedagogical, you know, function there. Right. But we're not really, there's not a lot of room to actually have those kinds of conversations. So now I don't know if, you know, I answered your question so much, but those are the kinds of ideas that I would say that we might want to think about. And, you know, in our program, it is one of the things that we've been talking about in relation to admissions is like, what are we reading for, right? What are you looking for in the 21-year-old, you know, like, do you actually want the person who already has a well-researched dissertation project, or do you want somebody who actually is just really curious about things and is maybe a little naive, you know? I don't mind that. I'd like to hold on to that, right?
Yeah, Ken, why don't you just go ahead?
Okay, yeah, thank you. Those for both talks, which I think were really provocative and rich. And I wanted to push a little bit on one of the things that you both indicated that you share, which is a kind of shying away from the idea of crisis or the notion of crisis. And I'm kind of wondering whether that's sort of a mistake for the following reasons, which is to say that if we don't understand that, say, the reason for this kind of work has to do with, you know, what we can call as the intensification of neoliberalization and the pressure that has put on academic institutions, higher education, and institutionality as such. I think it's going to be hard to identify the nature of the various problems that we're addressing, right? Because you could say as a feature of intense neoliberalization, what has become increasingly clear about, say, the university now, as opposed to something like the university at the moment of kind of the golden age that, we all disparage in some way, shape or form, is that, right now, to a greater extent than, say 20, 30, 40 years ago, perhaps even longer, right? The most serious form of overrepresentation in the universities in which we teach, for the most part, is the overrepresentation of the super wealthy. That is to say, and I don't have the figures here, but if you really look at whom we're educating, right, it's going to be the top 10, top 5, top 20%, and a serious underrepresentation of working class people of whatever color you're thinking about as such, right? And the second feature is with respect to where something like job growth and the like, you have the fact that the fastest growing employment sectors, jobs like home health care aides and the like, are jobs that don't require college education of any sort and poor paying jobs. So the first feature in terms of the thinking about one reason I would want to hang on to this notion of crisis would be to say, first of all, that these are problems that pedagogy isn't going to solve. However you think about reformulating it or thinking about it as such, right? It's not because who's in our classrooms is not going to change on, turn on a dime here at University of Chicago anytime soon, or in the foreseeable future. So it strikes me that that if we don't hang on to crisis, we perhaps produce a kind of one size fits all, despite what we're trying to do, a set of responses that may not be responsive to the problem that we are addressing. So the kind of production of production of taxonomies, neologization of what we do seems to be somehow a misfit in terms of what the problem to be addressed here. So I've got other things that I wanted to say here, but without going on and try to figure out the other line that I wanted to pursue. Why do you want to get rid of the notion of responding to crisis? That seems to me to be a fundamental mistake if you're going to try to understand where we are at this moment. And there's always continuity. There's always a way in which you can say that was a crisis and everybody's talking about a crisis. But I guess what I'm failing to see is the benefit in moving away from the notion that, hey, this is a crisis that we need to figure out how to address. We can address it pedagogically. We may be able to address it or move in the direction of addressing it in terms of thinking about our labor as labor, which means labor that ought to be organized, which moves us in the direction of supporting or adding our voices to unionization, which may be one of the institutions that forces out there best able to push back against neoliberalization, imperfect as it may be. That's what it's doing. Maybe professionalization, despite the problems with it, because it is going to be problematic, if it carries with it the idea that, professionalization, peer review, I take all the criticisms that, you, Heather, have made of it, right? But what it also embraces is the idea that internal to the university can be embrace of norms that that are not themselves immediately responsive to the expansion of market values elsewhere. You say that doesn't play here. Again, imperfect, but so the last, I'm sorry, I said I was going to finish and I'll finish right here, right? Is that it strikes me that hanging on to a kind of dialogization or dialectical approach to these terms, rather than sort of producing new taxonomies, might be the best way to get at the tensions that constitute the crisis of this moment. So let me stop there, and I apologize for that kind of messiness that I introduced into my question.
So part of my response to that is that I think crisis is a powerful rhetorical thing, strategy to name a thing a crisis. And I think, to my mind, it should be reserved for when there is something that we want to point out as being radically not the norm, right? How do we address this particular set of circumstances and conditions producing a particular thing? And I to my mind, thinking of neoliberalization as being really intensified at this point, I guess maybe it's literally just my positionality. Like, it's hard to see this as a crisis because I've been in higher education now for a decent amount of time. I mean, since like 2003, and it's been the same crisis the whole time. And it appears that it was the same crisis for a long time before that. And so to my mind, like, we need to think of the crises within the crisis that are truly new, right? So something like using bibliometrics in faculty assessment, right? That might turn out to suddenly be a crisis if that stuff comes from Europe over to here, and all of a sudden your citation counts become a core part of your evaluation. Something like that might be like a crisis that we respond to. I think unions are probably the best way to do that most of the time when it's possible. Yes, despite all their problems. But yeah, Candace, what would you say to this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not arguing that we shouldn't address the conditions to which crisis refers. I just don't know that wielding that as the central term has gotten us anywhere. And so, part of my thinking is a pragmatism, right? It is actually a pragmatism. It's just, we've been making these arguments against defunding. We've been making the arguments for better conditions. We've been making the arguments against neoliberalization for quite a while now. And we is union and intellectuals and some select, few elected officials. Yeah, I mean, it's not like we haven't had that. So I don't have a stake in whether we hold on to the term for other people. It's just, for me, it doesn't do anything for me. It doesn't move me in any way because I don't see it as moving us in any way. I mean, CUNY is perpetually in crisis, right? It has never not been, I think, probably since its founding. Our students are not the students from the University of Chicago, and our faculty are not the University of Chicago faculty either. And it isn't, it's just a different kind of relationship to the city, the people, the mission, all of those sorts of things. So the idea that there is a particular thing that we're going to name crisis, and I think this picks up on some of what Heather was talking about, in CUNY is hard because, who hasn't been in crisis in the last 80 years, right? Who hasn't been in that situation? So again, though, I mean, if there are times, when it is a specific kind of thing and we need to react immediately to it, I do understand what the salience of that term is and how it can mobilize things. But, in referring to the university or the situation of the humanities, in a very, very pragmatic way, I just don't see that it's done the work that we want it to do. If it starts doing that, great. I'm all for terms kind of coming back. I mean, I'm reclaiming aesthetic. Like, who knew? Who knew that I never did in my life. But so I don't think I'm disagreeing with you, Ken. I just, in terms of the address of the conditions, I just don't. I wish that the arguments had worked. I just don't see it. I wish that all of these incredibly meticulous studies that show greater impoverishment, less life, less health, less of everything over the last 60 years, were actually changing the scene. But I don't see that happening. I think my other thing too is like crisis. It's a little bit related to, when there is the kind of spectacular violences, right, that we've all been asked to respond to. I mean, over and over again, but, kind of spectacular violences. I think there's something about, the kind of Rob Nixon version of slow violence, right? Like, how do we then start to understand or to be able to make visible so that we can address long forms of impoverishment, long forms of the production of vulnerability, so that it isn't about a select sector, but it is actually in a kind of a much more broader view. And that's it. I'm just trying to figure out different ways of getting there.
I think that, well, one thing that I noticed also, Ken, was that even in your comment, crisis sort of gave way to intensification, which seemed to me like seems to me like a term that's kind of mediating between, you know, this has been going on, and this is an acute crisis. Sorry, in any case,
Oh, can I just say just really quickly here? But it might be the fact that, you know, for the Jameson quote, to have the force that you wanted to have, well, just if you wanted to have, that it ought to have, right, would be to say, well, you know, in 1930s, in the early 1940s, people were thinking about the end of capitalism in a way that it's not possible to think about that now. And if we don't see that as the crisis, if we don't see it as a crisis, then how can we expect anyone else to see that as a crisis? That would be the force of my, the broader force of my observation.
I think just because we are technically supposed to end at 6:30, maybe we can collect Eric and Abigail's comments or questions at once, and if Heather and Candace wouldn't mind responding to any combination of those two comments, that would be great, and then we'll call it a day. So I think, Eric, you had your hand up first, and then Abigail.
Thank you. I just wanted to thank you both for a great talk. Heather, I was curious about having sort of watched your project hatch and sort of develop. Previously, you had a deeply critical assessment of vocational approaches to scholarly work as, to a degree, sort of reconciling people to their conditions of labor. And I'm reminded of the time where I was adjuncting at College of Staten Island, where one of the writing instructors had her sons buy her a copy machine for her birthday so that she could make copies for her students of documents they needed. So to a degree, I saw, whoa, what a beautiful dedication and what a sense of mission she has. And on the other hand, like, oh my God, she's like, can't ever get a birthday present, right? Like, I don't know, just a thought. Curious if you have any more to say about that.
And I guess I can jump in as maybe to defend the crisis consensus theory a little bit. But as I know Heather knows, but I wrote an article on the crisis consensus with Nick Mitchell a couple of years ago, or God, 3 or 4 years ago now, kind of very much conscious and critical of the perspective of the crisis perspective. And it actually, hearing Kenneth's question, tapped into a question I was already wanting to ask you both, which is about where kind of Stuart Hall's work comes in for you all. Because that's what an echo I heard in both of your papers, where you're both towards the end invoked this notion of present conditions, right? Which is what he and his co-authors turned to at the end of Policing the Crisis. So I was wondering if you might want to elaborate more on what that kind of framework does for both of you in your work. And then I could go more into my concerns about crisis by Benjamin and Lauren's work and other people, but I don't think that there's time for that here. But I would love to hear if there's a way that, particularly as a cultural studies scholars, if there's a way that Hall is coming up for you in terms of this focus in towards the end on present conditions. So yeah, and thank you both for your talks. They were great. It was really wonderful to hear them.
Great. So I guess since Eric was first, I could address Eric's question really quickly. And I think you're right that I have sort of shifted my thinking about vocationalism, and it's the only term coming to mind right now is political possibility, but I feel like that's not what I want to say. Mm-hmm. But so I think when I was researching the early 20th century, vocationalist takes on academic labor tended to seem like they just kind of, they'd fritter out at the end of every essay, right? You'd have these extraordinary descriptions of teachers wearing secondhand clothes that they got from their student or their students' parents, and then the students laughing at them when they're wearing these clothes, right? Is kind of the 1907 version of the copy machine for your birthday. And I felt like in those instances, most of the time, the problem with vocational takes is they can tend to really individualize solutions, right? They can just snowplow right into self-care and stay at self-care. And I think I'm trying to figure out how something more than self-care comes out of these modes of work, because I think the more that I listen to this kind of writing as opposed to professionalists and unionist takes. And of course, these are sort of false dimensions, but it's a way to talk about academic labor in much more specific terms than we've had before. But I think the more I kind of listen to these perspectives, I don't want to fault them for not having a solution, because really, who does have a solution? And then we sit here and critique professionalism solutions, which have actually been incredibly effective for a lot of things, right? All day. So I don't really want to go and critique like going to self-care is the solution in books like The Slow Professor and stuff like that, right? But that's where I think vocationalism needs to be tied to unionism, and I think both can gain from the other. In that, I think there's a lot of work academic unions need to do in order to pitch a bigger tent than they're pitching, and in order to bring a lot more people under that tent. I mean, it's a bit shocking that in the like 900 pages of Presumed Incompetent, that there is one mention of unions and that's it. There is never a moment in these books where any faculty member sees a union as a resource or anything, right? And I think there needs to be some way to bring this kind of vocational tendency together with thinking about labor organizing. And I actually think that's where decolonial and abolitionist approaches, which I know I painted with a very big brush in this talk, the way that those approaches, I actually think all that together can somehow turn into something. I'm not there yet on what that is. And I think it's going to take a lot more thinking with people to get there.
I think, one of the things I heard in your paper, Heather, and maybe this kind of responds to Eric and then moves to Abigail's question a bit, is that you're inviting us really to think about how and why certain narratives of the ways in which we understand our work, right, are available, right? So it isn't about faulting any individual person for attaching to it, but rather about the availability of those narratives and the kind of work that they do in preserving the status quo, but then also in kind of moving us in different ways and allowing us really to understand what the actual experience of work life is, right, on a daily basis. And I think that there is something there. I don't know, like that example of the copy machine, some of the other terms that I've been trying to think with and work with are mutual aid and solidarity economy, right? So what if, like, instead of vocation, right, we thought of that as a kind of moment of solidarity economy? I have a way to get you the paper that you need, and I'm going to be in solidarity with you, because if you don't have it, we can't do our work together. We can't actually move forward together. So, I don't want to slide it into like, and so therefore it's all really virtuous, right? But rather, again, like, it's really practical. There's a practical aspect to thinking our futures are connected, because they actually are, right? So if we don't start to activate different ways of narrativizing those kinds of connections, then I think we constantly start pulling apart from each other, right? And Abigail, for me, I mean, Stuart Hall is such a foundational critic, right? I mean, really, I grew up in graduate studies, through Stuart Hall, that I can't not think of, like, when I think the material conditions of possibility for the production and circulation of anything, that's for me, him in the background talking, right? And bringing forward the Caribbean epistemologies and the British epistemologies and the knowledge of popular culture, as well as the knowledge of high cultural texts and, all of that together. So, and more recently, just before I think he passed, he had done some work that was really revisiting the idea of common sense and putting it in relation to good sense. And this is the Gramsci version, right, of the kind of relationship and distinction between those things. And, that was just another moment at which I was like, right, like, this is where the resonance is. And this is the long conversation that he's having, right, to help us understand how culture and politics must be thought together, right? Culture, politics, and political economy can't be separated out. So it is, I know it sounds kind of wrong, I think, but it's actually one of the reasons that I've become interested in aesthetics, not as an expressive mode, but actually as a way in which our bodily matter is organized, right? Through political economy, through culture and politics, through all of the things that through the ways in which we move and inhabit space. that for me is very much a kind of Stuart Hall version of cultural studies. So. I don't want to have the last word. Heather should have the last word.
I don't have a
Heather?
last word to have. I'm just coming out from like I'm in my reading primary sources until there are no more primary sources to read, and like Stuart Hall is right there on my list of things to go back to think with, but I have not revisited Hall recently enough to have a thing to say, which is a terrible last word.
But I do think that, I mean, something that came up in both of those talks is in both of your talks that really does resonate with that moment of British cultural studies is that sense of the tension between the intellectual formation and the institution as the site of incorporation, right? And I think that there was a way in which Hall and Williams, for that matter, were really attuned to the kind of incipient, like the sort, the precarity of the labor hegemony at that moment in the late 60s, and the sort of threat that was posed by the institution seemed really palpable to them. And I found that also to be a really resonant and useful body of work to return to at this moment, when we're so often, as you both were, I think so provocatively and productively, kind of wrestling with that threat of incorporation into the institution as the sort of dominant structure. And so it was, I thought that I had a similar question to Abigail. But in any case, I think we're over, and probably many of us have to go and become different people, or standing up people or whatever. But thank you both so much for these incredible presentations and for sharing your work with us. And thanks to all of you for attending from all over the world and at whatever time of the middle of the night it is, wherever you are. And please do, I hope many of you will come back next week on Thursday for Nick Mitchell and Jennifer Doyle's continuation of this Critical University mini-series. So thanks again to everybody.
Thank you.
And
Thank you, Zach. And
yeah,
thank you, Heather. It was
Yes,
great
thanks
to see
to
you.
both of you, and thanks to everyone for coming.
Yeah. Bye, everyone.
Bye, good night.